Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Charles Godfrey. I'm the director here, and I have a very simple job to do this evening, which is to introduce our host. It's Ricardo Soares de Oliveira. Ricardo is professor of the International Politics of Africa in the Politics Department here, and is just coming to the end of a very prestigious Leverhulme British Academy Senior Research Fellowship. And Ricardo's been involved with the school for a long time, most recently as the co-director of our program on African governance. So Ricardo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Welcome to today's event. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Sergei Guriev, who is the Dean of the London Business School, to the Oxford Martin School. Dean Guriev is Research Fellow at the Center of Economic Policy Research in London. He is also a senior member of the Institut Universitaire de France, a member of the Académie Européenne, and an honorary foreign member of the American Economic Association. He was selected as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in 2006 and has held visiting appointments at MIT and at Princeton. Professor Guriev received the degree of Doctor of Science in Economics from the Russian Academy of Sciences and served as a professor of economics and rector at the new economic school in Moscow until 2013, when he departed Russia. He has also served as professor of economics and provost at Sciences Po Paris and was the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development from 2016 to 2019. His extensive and highly regarded body of work spans many areas of economics, from labor mobility and corporate governance to the political economy of development, and has been published in the leading international journals. Most recently, he has co-authored Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century, which was chosen as Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker, by Foreign Affairs, and the Financial Times, amongst other publications. Sergei, we are delighted to have you with us today. The subject of today's talk is the fight against misinformation on social media. Following the rise of social networks and the spread of disinformation and misinformation on social media, political scientists, social psychologists, and media scholars have proposed and studied several instruments to slow down propagation of false news. In this talk, Professor Guriev will discuss the recent research on, from the perspective of economics of fighting misinformation and fake news on social media. The insights of this talk obviously matter for our contemporary understanding of populist politics and democratic systems, but also regarding the rise of influential misinformation campaigns by authoritarian regimes. So without further ado, please.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you very much, Ricardo, for a generous welcome. Indeed, this is an area where a lot of work has been done by non-economists, but economists have been reasonably recent to this debate, have come reasonably recently, and mostly I will talk about my own work, but I will also tell you about other economists' work. I would just say that, as Ricardo said, we are living in historical times. We are living inside a revolution which is happening in front of our eyes in the last 15 years. If you think about internet is now mobile broadband internet around the world. 15 years ago, I see a lot of young people, but also not so young people around the room. 2007 is not far away, but in 2007, about 4% of global population had access to mobile broadband internet. At that point, internet was fixed broadband, but over the years, and especially in developing countries, people now connect to internet through mobile devices and get 3G, 4G, and 5G, and you see the stratospheric growth. These are official data from International Telecommunications Union. That is a stratospheric growth which happened in front of our eyes, and of course served as a main platform for social media. Now we are talking about 5 billion people on social media, and of course the most important platforms are accessed via mobile devices. And of course, political scientists, economists, social scientists of all disciplines ask questions about implications of this revolution. And just to put it in front of you right away, there are optimistic and pessimistic views. Some people say it's a liberation technology, help to mobilize protesters, help circumvent censorship. On the other hand, people also say that social media are used to propagate misinformation, disinformation, connect populists to voters, and also, as Ricardo said, are now mastered by non-democratic governments as well. So there is a lot of research in political science, in media studies, in social psychology. And as I said, economics research has come reasonably recently. Actually, as recent as in 2016, people would still publish papers saying internet has not contributed to polarization by looking at long-term data. But what you need to look into is, of course, the last 10, 15 years, because internet before 2007, and especially before 2010, when Facebook added the like button, was different. That was a different animal. Now, one thing I would like to mention is this excellent survey by 4 reasonably young scholars, stars in this media, in this field called Economics and Social Media, which is coming out in Journal of Economic Literature, which is the top economics surveys journal. And basically, this survey is comprehensive. It talks about economists' views on why people produce information on social media, how they consume social media, how they spread information. And so this is the survey I highly recommend. So what do economists bring to the table? In political science and social psychology, there are many very sophisticated and large sample experiments where we try different interventions, treatments, see how people react to different formulations of statements, whether effects are persistent, whether there is backfiring of treatments, and so on. Economists also do that, and I myself have done that myself, and I'll mention 1 or 2 papers that we wrote running experiments. Actually, we just had an experiment on this campaign in the United States. May want to mention a few words, even though we still don't have results. But what are economists good at is also modeling different incentives, different motives for sharing this information. I'll talk about that later, but we actually can build quantitative models of why people share false news, why people share political information in general, how they want to influence the audience, how they want to signal to the audience their own political affiliation, how they want to project the image of being competent and informed. We can actually distinguish those effects, and we can actually see how treatments can influence those incentives. This is what economists are reasonably good at, and this is what we do. And I'll mention my own work on this, but we are not the first. The first paper in that direction is Angelucci and Pratt, which just came out in the top journal. There is also another thing. Economists use economy-wide data. And one of the papers on mental health effects of Facebook is, again, a recent paper by Braghieri and co-authors in American Economic Review as well, where they look at the college students in the United States, looking at a rollout of Facebook in American colleges, and identify a causal effect on mental health. Surprise, surprise, negative. And that is actually very fascinating work. Now, what is also important for economists is analysis of cost and benefits. Economists think in terms of welfare, and we just don't want to say social media is bad. Let's try to over-regulate social media. We understand that social media carries out potentially useful, it performs potentially useful functions, and we want to measure and identify the interventions which can, for example, slow down dissemination of false news and accelerate dissemination of true news. So these are different ways of looking at things where economists can contribute, and a lot of economists are actually excited about this. Now, before going further, I would just mention a discussion in this survey on internet and social media that social media is actually quite special as a telecommunication channel. Ricardo mentioned populists. Populists often are first to use the new telecommunication technology because the old existing status quo telecommunication technology is controlled by the elites, by the mainstream. So to circumvent mainstream, populists usually pick up the new technology. The first populist, William Jennings Bryan, would use telegraph and railroads. Goebbels would use radio. Today, many populists use social media because there is something very special about social media in addition to being a new technology. First, low barriers to entry. You don't need to have an expensive machinery to use Twitter. And you can just say, I'm like you. I'm not rich. I'm a simple person. And I'm happy to be connected to you without fundraising billions and billions to fund my campaign. The other thing is, of course, two-way communication. And again, this is what is very important for populists. You create this feeling that we are in touch, or I'm listening to you, I'm a person of the people, please tell me what you think, and let's interact on social media, which is very different from broadcast media, as you can imagine. So it is something very special, and that's why people are saying that politics is changing, and we have what Martin Guriev says, we now have Homo informaticus. So there is a book by Martin Guriev which is called The Revolt of the Public, which came out in 2014, and then he published a second edition in 2018 after the events of 2016. This book has not been very much appreciated in 2014. It kind of came out before its time. Martin Guriev was a CIA analyst studying media around the world, and eventually he understood that media is changing, social media are changing, and democratic and non-democratic governments are facing a major challenge. Internet is very good in disseminating critical information. It's very hard to make mistakes if you're in the government. You get criticized right away. So we actually test this hypothesis in one of the papers. This is the paper we wrote together with Ekaterina Zhuravskaya and Nikita Melnikov. It came out in 2021. In this paper, we look at the whole world and see what happens when you get connected to mobile broadband internet. So we split the whole world into grid cells in subnational regions, and for each subnational region, we look at the Gallup data of confidence in government. And basically that's about 1 million observations, and we look exactly at this period of rollout of mobile broadband internet. It's actually 2007 to 2018. And in general, these are the years, as I said, where you see huge change in mobile broadband internet. Here, dots are where you get 3G coverage in 2007, and here when you get 3G coverage in 2018. And so you see a big change. And the yellow areas are the countries for which we have Gallup data. So for those countries, we can actually check how appearance of a dot changes political attitudes. So the main exercise is to see whether arrival of mobile broadband internet changes confidence in government. And basically the result is it goes down. It goes down. So basically this is the size of the effect. If you go from 0 mobile broadband coverage to 100% mobile broadband coverage, your confidence in government goes down by about 6 percentage points. This is a lot because the confidence in government in those data sets is about 50%. So, and that, of course, can decide an election. And I'll talk about elections in a second. And that is strikingly across different measures of confidence in institutions. Confidence in government, confidence in judiciary system, confidence in elections, confidence in government not being corrupt, which is never high, but goes lower. And also aggregate measure of those. So blue is before arrival of mobile broadband. red is after, and the bands are confidence intervals. So this is a statistically significant and major change that we observe. Now, on the other hand, we do find some evidence on the liberation technology or accountability technology front as well. So we do see that governments that are more corrupt get more critical attitudes when mobile broadband arrives. We also see that if governments censor traditional media, arrival of mobile broadband creates more negative attitudes to the government. And also when social media and internet is censored, there is no effect. So if you manage to censor internet, you are not afraid of mobile broadband, internet, and social media. Now, what is interesting though, this is something which is very worrisome. You would ask a question, okay, maybe when the government is very clean, if you have more information about how clean your government is, the approval of government should go up. And that is the case in the top 10% cleanest countries, like top 10 countries, top 12 countries, top 14 countries. The borderline is actually the United States. But countries like New Zealand, Sweden, Switzerland, these countries actually are seeing increase in confidence in government when mobile broadband arrives. Why and how? Well, we think that this is because people understand how much more corrupt other countries are. But what is worrisome here is the 10% number, right? Because that means that our assumption that for half of the countries, probably people would realize that these countries are cleaner than the rest of the world. And for half of the countries, dirtier than the rest of the world. It should be not 10%, but more like 50%. And that is actually something that economists would immediately notice and ask this question. And there are two explanations. One is this Martin Guriev story that elites were too complacent and people had their idealistic view of the elites and thought that elites are actually honest, benevolent, non-corrupt, and suddenly we wake up to this horrible reality. The other explanation is that social media are actually a platform for disseminating critical information, which is more likely than positive information. And there is actually work by social psychologists which call this effect dark psychology of social media, arguing that the business model of advertising-based social media is actually about attracting attention. Truth and good news are boring. Critical information is exciting. And in that sense, both can be true. But overall, there are arguments why we think that social media can actually disseminate more critical information, even if your government is relatively clean. Now, Ricardo mentioned populist. There is an exercise we do for Europe. We collect all data on elections in Europe in this period. And we look at subnational regions, about 400 subnational regions in Europe, including UK, including some non-EU countries as well. So it's about 100 elections. And we look what happens if between the elections you have increase in mobile broadband coverage. And the answer is incumbents lose. Incumbents lose about 10%, 9% of the vote. If you move from 0 coverage to 100% coverage, average European regions at that point moved from 40% to 90%. So actually about 5 percentage points of loss of incumbent vote share can be attributed to arrival of mobile broadband internet. And actually, these are the populists who pick up those votes. Right-wing populists and left-wing populists benefit from arrival of mobile broadband internet. And if you actually look at the increase in populist vote share, you can attribute half of that increase to mobile broadband internet in Europe. So interestingly, non-populist opposition doesn't get anything, and Green parties at that period didn't get anything. So we didn't repeat this exercise after 2018. Maybe 2019 was actually already different, but at least in this period, Green parties didn't benefit. So why populists benefit? As I mentioned, social media are especially fitting tool, platform for populist narratives. lower barriers to entry, two-way communication, circumvention of gatekeepers who remain with the mainstream media, and of course, social media are very good for disseminating short and emotional messages. And this is something that I'll talk about that in a second. Now, interestingly, and this is interesting in our results, then when you think about populist incumbents, if populists are in office, are they benefiting from social media as populists, or are they losing as incumbents? And the answer is incumbents are losing even if they're populists. So anyway, so just to summarize what I told you so far, mobile broadband internet actually serves as both accountability technology, but also as populism promoting technology. And we, in that study, don't really tell you whether there is polarization. We don't have data on polarization. And we don't talk actually about the mechanism, how false news are circulating online. And this is what I'm going to tell you about in a second. On polarization, I didn't work on polarization, but my co-author Nikita Melnikov did this work on the US, doing a similar exercise in the US, where he looked at counties which used to be democratic. With the arrival of mobile broadband internet, they become more democratic. He looked at the counties which were more Republican, and with the arrival of mobile broadband internet, they become more Republican. So it's actually true that in the US, at the local level, polarization has increased when mobile broadband internet arrived. Now, there is a study which is something that a social psychologist or a political scientist would do, but this was done by economists. This is famous Facebook deactivation experiment that's been replicated with different results. When I say replicated, re-implemented by political scientists around the world. Results are sometimes different, but polarization result usually survives. So this is an experiment where people are paid not to use Facebook for a month. This is a randomized controlled trial, so we can actually identify causal effects. And basically, results which are coming from this particular paper is that Facebook actually is serving as a tool of political information. People are more knowledgeable when they use Facebook relative to those who deactivate their Facebook. Facebook increases polarization in political beliefs. Facebook reduces subjective well-being, and there are results on addiction. And part of the proof on the addiction is when you deactivate, and then people can come back. They actually use Facebook less, and some people don't come back because they notice how happy they are, not reading polarizing factual news on Facebook. Anyway, so let me now talk about how social media disseminate misinformation, disinformation. There is a paper where when we ran an experiment in France, basically when we showed people false misleading statements from Marine Le Pen, then we showed some of the people facts on immigration, then we showed some people quotes from Marine Le Pen and facts, and we tried to see whether fact-checking corrects factual beliefs and political views. And basically, when people are given information from Marine Le Pen, they want to vote for Marine Le Pen. If they are given, on top of that, they are given fact-checking, they understand the facts. When we quiz them on the facts, they do say, yes, we know these are how many immigrants who work. There are how many immigrants from Syria who are men, women, and children, but we still want to vote for Marine Le Pen. And interestingly, even when we showed people facts without quotes from Marine Le Pen, but just showed them facts on immigration, people wanted to vote for Marine Le Pen. And here we move away from economics and we talk about salience of certain political issues. Once you trigger the debate on immigration, people start thinking about who is going to solve immigration issue. And in a French environment, that would be Marine Le Pen. Now, the question is, if it's too late to do fact-checking post factum, can we do something about limiting circulation of false news on the social media? And we have a paper which shows that, yes, you can. You can actually limit circulation of false news on social media by fact-checking, by even suggesting fact-checking. So in one of our experiments, we told people, if you like, you can click on this link and get fact-checking of this quote from Marine Le Pen. And 40% of people clicked, 60% of people didn't click, and still shared much less of false news. So, and actually both groups had a similar effect, which was pretty large, by 40%. Sharing of false news was reduced by about 40%. So these things suggest that fact-checking does work. And even this voluntary suggested fact-checking, just sending a message that you can fact-check, already works. And also we saw that if you ask people for additional clicks, people share much less, like 4 times less. So you want to share false news, and I'm asking you, are you sure you want to share false news? 3/4 of people don't follow that trajectory, just drop this idea. Yeah. So the question is what we do with that. Now, I should tell you that Twitter in May 2020 did some interventions on Donald Trump's quotes about protests and about mail vote. Twitter did certain interventions which were very similar to what we did in 2019 when we ran this experiment for this paper. I'm pretty sure that Twitter has run same experiments but didn't share the results with us. But then the question is, okay, fact-checking is not cheap. Fact-checking is costly for being produced by fact-checkers, but also for users because it triggers mental energy. It is time and time consuming, and it's also consuming mental energy. And now the other question is, if we ask you, are you sure you want to share? That's a very effective intervention to slow down sharing. But it may also slow down sharing good stuff. And actually, when people try to measure how much bad stuff is on social media, we find that it's very small. A lot of people never share false news, and false news are a very small minority of content on social media. They are very noticeable, of course, but still, we don't want to stop sharing altogether because, as I said, social media are an important source of political information for people. And now this is what we think about, and this is what I'm going to still have 10 minutes. I'll tell you about the last paper, which you are very excited about. But basically, the story here is, can we design interventions which slow down sharing of false news, but facilitate and even accelerate sharing of true news? Now, there is, of course, a debate that we want platforms be regulated or self-regulated. Ricardo told me that he will ask this question afterwards, so let me not talk about this later. No. So what we did in this last paper that is being rewritten right now. We actually ran the second experiment in 2024. This experiment was run in 2022. So basically, this is a paper where again we run a very complex experiment, but we have a model, and this model allows us to identify the mechanism through which those sharing of content on Twitter works. Now, these are 4 pieces of news we used, and this just for you. The true tweet was about Florida schools ordered to provide bathrooms separated by biological sex. About 7% in control group shared that. Biden administration open application process for student loan reliefs. 23% shared that in the control group. We also showed pictures because it's clear that people are more likely to share stuff with visuals. These are 2 false false pieces of content that we shared. We didn't come up with that, right? We found that on fact-checking websites. So this is Supreme Court voted to ban condoms, and Biden is adding more IRS agents that we have police detectives in the country. And basically, again, we didn't come up with that. It's what's circulating on social media. So we had 5 interventions. One was a control group. One of the interventions was we required extra click for sharing if you want to share. We also had priming intervention, which is simply a health warning. We just told people, please think carefully before you retweet. Remember that there are lots of false news circulating on social media. That's it. That was the intervention. Just telling you, don't forget about a risk of sharing false news. And then we offered fact check. And then we also asked, before sharing, we asked people to think, do you think this is actually a true or false tweet? And do you think this is going to benefit Republicans or Democrats? So this is a fact-checking treatment where we just said you can click and see the fact check, or you don't want to see fact check, okay, no problem. And as I said, some people wanted to see both fact checks, some none. But as we said in the previous paper, what happens there is even if you don't click, you learn something from the fact that fact check is available and you're less likely to share this content. Now, one of the things which is very interesting, this is a paper where we incentivize evaluation of veracity. This is very common now in this literature. I'm not asking a Republican voter, do you think that the tweet which is benefiting Republicans is true or false? I'm telling this person, if you guess correctly, I'll pay you $1, right? And people are very good when they're incentivized in those experiments, evaluating veracity. And there is a paper by Angelucci and Pratt, which in economics was a pioneer in that literature. And 3/4 of the people for true tweets are saying they're true. And 36% of people who are seeing a false tweet say it's true. So there's a huge gap. So people are not bad in evaluating veracity. So regarding Democratic and Republican tweets, it actually was very interesting that it's much less clear divide because, again, if you think the tweet is false, dissemination of this tweet, is it going to hurt this party or that party? It was not that clear. Anyway, so one of the things which I'll show you, and this is the main takeaway from this paper, is when you look at the sharing of false tweets, all of our interventions reduce sharing of false tweets. And those interventions like fact check and priming had a major effect. So in the control group, 28% people shared false news, half after intervention. But what is striking is this picture. When we asked people to share true news, so how many people shared true news? 30% in the control group, plus 8% after priming. And fact-checking actually reduced sharing of true news. Priming increased sharing of true news. So for us, this is a clear champion in this race, which is priming. Very light touch intervention. Now, how do we explain that? Basically, I still have 5 minutes, so I'll tell you, but just to jump ahead, fact-checking is costly, and people don't like costs. Priming is very easy intervention. You don't need to think too much, and you don't need to read anything, and don't even think about reading anything. And so basically, this is what we do in this paper. We model different motives. We model different mechanisms. So we think about how those treatments can change your view whether content is true or false, Republican or Democrat. We also think about salience. Priming may actually trigger your realization that the news may be false, and your reputation as an informed and competent person may suffer. And of course, all these interventions include costs, like additional click on fact-checking, and so on. So that should actually reduce sharing. And we are able to model those things explicitly. As I said, we consider several motives of sharing, like you want to influence your audience that Republican or Democratic statement is true. You may want to signal that you are partisan. So I may actually want to say that, yes, I know this content is likely to be false, but I don't care. As long as it's partisan, I want to share partisan content. Moreover, if people see that I'm sharing false partisan content, that actually is a stronger signal that I'm okay suffering from losing my information of being competent as long as it's partisan. So we model that as well. And a lot of people told us that's a very important thing to discuss, so we added that to the model. And so we measure that. We actually, the model has predictions, how different motives contribute to the impact of veracity and partisan alignment of tweets on sharing. So we do that. I'll not I will not talk about this. But once finally, what we can do, we can actually measure those effects. Effect of updating veracity and alignment. So I show you a fact-checking link, and you think it's probably more likely that this tweet is actually incorrect. We also talk about silence. So when people start thinking about reputation more than partisan motives, and the cost itself. And so what we are able to do there, we can actually quantitatively evaluate that. And we show that, for example, updating channel is very weak, surprisingly weak. So there are effects, but these effects are very, very small. But what is strong is salience effect and the cost effect. And basically, what we show, we can actually decompose the effects of interventions on sharing of false and true tweets. So this graph is pretty much the same graph as the one I showed you. Sorry for this. The one I showed you here. So that graph will be showing you the differences between those bars decomposed into different mechanisms. And I'm sorry for being too quick about this, but basically the story is we can actually say that priming reduces false news circulation mostly through salience effect. So people, when we show them this priming message, health warning, like a cigarette pack warning that cigarettes are bad for your health, you wake up to this idea and you share false news less and true news more. And the positive effect of priming intervention is mostly through silence. Now, cost is always negative for sharing true and false, but it turns out that this cost is very high for fact-checking, smaller for priming, and overall salience wins over cost, and people are likelier to share true news more when you see the priming. So basically, the story is that you have some very simple interventions which promote sharing of good stuff. That makes it incentive compatible for companies, right? Because it's very hard to regulate social media companies. We don't want to destroy their business. They don't want us to destroy their business. They will not like very heavy regulations. And so these messages may actually work very well. So basically, that's what I just said. The story is that priming intervention works really well. And it works very well because it doesn't involve high cost for the users, and yet delivers salience of reputational concerns. So, oops, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so let me just say that one of the things you can also do, you can combine those things. Fact-checking is very costly to produce, but you can run fact-checking algorithmically, and then also add those health warnings if you like. But let me actually stop here, and I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Sergei, thank you very much. I have a first question for you, which has to do, you mentioned towards the end interventions, and earlier in your presentation, you had quickly compared the US and the EU approach. The EU approach is not so light touch, it's more regulatory. In the US context, it's been more a matter of self-regulation. So the question would be, how do you rate these efforts at self-regulation from social media platforms themselves?
Right. So before recent changes in social media industry, in particular acquisition of Twitter by Elon Musk, social media were pressed into self-regulation in the US, where they would use algorithms to identify suspicious content and then recruit independent fact checkers and pay them to fact check. Now, one of my co-authors, Americ Henry, has a project, which is not yet a paper, where he actually works with one of the biggest fact checkers in the world, Agence France Presse, AFP, which fact checks both French language and English language and other language news. And what they see is the algorithm is not well trained. So Facebook has underinvested in that algorithm identifying false news. And second issue, and this is not just AFP, but globally it is very clear that social media they dedicate very limited resources to fact checking. So from what the community of fact checkers and media scholars say, it's just not enough. And it's not enough for a very simple reason. The whole business model is about disseminating attention-grabbing content. And yet, after 2016-17, social media platforms created a lot of trust and safety departments. And there is a lot of research in 2020 showing that in 2020, social media companies have not really had major negative political impact. So these studies were done together with Meta, with Facebook, and about 20 political scientists, psychologists, and one economist, Matt Gensko. These were randomized, pre-registered experiments. And overall, I would say that we cannot say it doesn't work at all. But it's certainly insufficient. And in Europe, we have Digital Services Act, which I mentioned on the slides, which takes effect now, this year. There are many things which are changing for social media platforms. Actually, one of the things that everybody's advocated is a subscription-based model. So companies, social media companies, are forced to offer subscription-based model in Europe, not in the UK. People don't know about that, but you can actually buy Facebook subscription and you'll be shown zero advertising. Nobody's doing that. Nobody wants to pay 10 or 13 euros per month for having access to ad-free Facebook. But there are interventions like this. Most importantly, Digital Services Act requires social media companies to give researchers access to the data, to see the algorithms, basically, to see how algorithms work. And I think this is actually very, very important. So in the EU, there is a lot more regulation. Going further, I should say that EU also wants to regulate artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence industry says it's going to kill artificial intelligence in Europe. So in that particular case, people are saying that EU is going too far. On social media, I think the consensus is EU is doing the right thing, probably later than it should.
Sergei, it's interesting that in putting your point across that these self-regulatory efforts have a lot of shortcomings and they're insufficient.
Yeah.
You didn't even mention the cases of willfully partisan social media platforms like X has turned out to be more recently. Even at the best of times, the effort seems to be insufficient. Let me ask you another question, which this the year we just had the elections 10 days ago. Perhaps you'd like to address that. The question is, how can we actually better assess the impact of disinformation on actual voter behavior, as opposed to the climate around politics and more difficult to pin down dynamics?
Right. So talking about X platform, so Elon Musk actually published bits and pieces of his algorithm, and which is very, very welcome. Everybody was very happy about it, and he said, if the news is about Ukraine war, this is how much we promote it. If the news is about this, this is how much we promote. And part of that algorithm was moderators have no right to stop circulation of news coming from those right-wing sources. Literally, this is part of the algorithm. So there is moderation on X, but part of the rules are you cannot actually censor right-wing sources. So this is part of the algorithm. Before X on Twitter, I mentioned May 2020. I just remind you what happened. So Donald Trump has written a tweet saying he was talking about BLM protests, and he said, when looting starts, shooting starts. So Twitter at that point decided that this tweet glorifies violence, But they said, look, we don't like glorifying violence. It's against our rules. But this is politically important. So if you want to see this tweet, click here. So when you come to this tweet, you don't see the tweet, but you see the screen which says, you want to see Donald Trump's tweet, which may be insulting you because it's glorifying violence? Click again. And so, as I said, that probably meant that a lot of people did not share that content, didn't see that content. And another thing which Twitter did, and again, this is no limitation of freedom of speech, just an additional click requirement. Another thing that they did, when Donald Trump said the mail vote is fraudulent, Twitter said, this tweet may contain misleading information. You want fact check and click on this link, literally. And that, as our research shows, probably also limited circulation of that content. But overall, these are light touch interventions. And again, I said that fact checking is not that light touch. But this is not limitation of freedom of speech. It's just health warning that don't share in the first second, think, right? So there are things that social media have done well. Now on voting, so there is a lot of research on voting intentions, right? And I showed you references to some papers which show, as I said, political scientists show you content, and they see if this content affects your self-reported voting intentions. On actual voting, it's much harder to do because we still have secret ballot in democratic countries. And we can only observe voting at the level of polling district. Only in Argentina you can observe at sub-district. And we have a paper on this on the recent election 2023, Milei election, where we actually had an intervention at the level of sub-district, and we saw how voting was differentiated at the sub-district and neighboring sub-district level. So it's a fascinating story, but don't have time to talk about this. But overall, there are very few studies like this. As I said, in 2020, there was a number of studies which came out more or less neutral in terms of effect of Facebook on voting intentions. And these are very respected political scientists who were involved. There is no reason to suspect that there was foul play. But there is actually one explanation that my co-author and wife, Ekaterina Zhuravskaya, is working on right now. She's working on Twitter. Twitter is, again, forced to offer you two versions of Twitter. One is called For You, and one is called Following. Right? If you open your Twitter, you see that you can consume content from people you follow in reverse chronological order, if you want. Much less fun. People don't want to do that. It's not that exciting, because the other thing which is called For You, this is where algorithm selects stuff for you, stuff which is more likely to be exciting for you, based on what you've seen before, what you clicked on. And so a lot more people, of course, are using For You. But so what Ekaterina Zhuravskaya and co-authors do, they actually run a controlled, randomized controlled trial where some people are forced to do For You and some are forced to do Following, and then they switch back. And so the story is very simple. When you do reverse chronological order, you're more likely to vote left. When you are switched into today's Twitter, X, Elon Musk X, when you use the algorithm, you are more likely to vote right. Now, when you switch, actually, once you switch to the algorithmic feed, you vote right. When you switch back, you still vote right. So, and maybe this absorbing state is what we've observed on Facebook by 2020. Maybe it's already too late. After you've been consuming algorithm for so long, maybe it's too late to observe it. And so maybe our studies were just too late by 2020. And unfortunately, we didn't do them early enough. We didn't realize that how much more we should learn in 2016 and 17. Yeah.
One last question before we open the floor. We have lots of interesting people with lots of experience in the audience, and it would be great to hear from the public. But in Spin Dictators, you and your co-author, you show brilliantly how a new generation of authoritarians learned over the last 2 decades to master and distort information, sometimes mimicking democratic procedures, and through that, consolidating regimes internally. Can you tell us a little bit about the international story of that? How that authoritarian management of information fans out into the international context, and in particular how it leads to building up influence within open societies. And related to that, the question is whether this information nexus, is that the nexus where Western populists and global kleptocrats and authoritarians converge? So.
Right. These are questions which are answered by a 400-page book, which I encourage you to buy. In one country, actually, they translated the book without paying royalties, without notifying the publisher, so it was reasonably well priced. That pirated, yeah, that's been very flattering. Eventually, we regularized that relationship with the publisher, but there was a cheap edition which was translated without our knowledge. But basically, this is a book which talks exactly about this: how in this century, majority of non-democratic leaders are not like 20th century's authoritarians. In 20th century, non-democratic leaders were proud to be non-democratic. They were not hiding repression. They adopted ideologies. In 21st century, non-democratic leaders are pretending to be Democrats, and instead of terrorizing the population, they manipulate information. They pretend to be Democrats. And part of this pretense is also being open internationally. This is very important. North Korea has closed borders. Soviet Union had closed borders. East Germany built a wall. Today, most non-democratic regimes let you go and also bring foreigners in because they pretend to be an open country. And this is very important for this pretense, because also the business model of those regimes is to benefit from global economy, to bring in investment, to bring in modern technology, and have some form of economic performance, some form of economic development. And so for these regimes, it's very important to be open. And as we say in the book, as the East has become more like the West has become a bit more like the East. Unfortunately, they also export corruption to Western capitals. And basically, the idea is just a win-win proposition, in the sense that if this corruption is not discovered, we corrupt Western politicians, they don't sanction us, they don't lecture us about human rights and freedoms. If corruption is discovered, you go back to your voters inside the country and you say, you are accusing me of corruption, but look at those Western politicians, they also take money from us, they're also corrupt, right? And so this narrative that we are like them, maybe they are Democrats, we are Democrats, maybe we are imperfect Democrats, but they are also not perfect, right? And so exporting this corrupt funding is a very important part of this business model, in terms of narrative, also in terms of penetration of Western democratic institutions. And of course, some of the willing partners of those non-democratic leaders would be authoritarian populists. Now, not all populists are authoritarian. Some populists lose elections and just step down. But those who want to be authoritarian leaders start as populists, win elections. And actually, there is a paper by my former colleague from Sciences Po, Moritz Schularik, which looks at all populists in the last 100 years. And they quantify what happens on average when populists come to power. And basically, the average story is like this. Populists come to power, bad news for economics, right? So after 15 years of populists in power, GDP is 10 percentage points lower relative to non-populists in power in a similar country. Now, why does that happen, and what happens to democratic institutions? So populists come to power, economy is not doing well, populists cannot deliver on the promises, which were probably not sustainable to start with. And so populists, instead of stepping down, on average, undermines democratic institutions, rule of law, manipulates media, and then tries not to step down. And this is the average story. The majority of populists are doing this and try to turn their country into non-democratic political system. And there are papers talking about various modern populists, how they try to co-opt or implicitly censor media. And some of that is happening actually in Europe. And economists are very good in quantifying those effects, showing how a European populist would buy online media, and suddenly editorial policy of this media changes, stops criticizing corruption, right? So this is, there are quite a few papers on this about populists in office in the 21st century.
Okay. I suggest we open the floor. If you could please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask a brief question so that we have as many contributions as possible. Pepper.
Thanks for that wonderful. Thank you for that informative and wonderful talk. And I just wanted to, sorry, I'm Pepper Culpepper from the Blavatnik School here at Oxford. You didn't really talk, Ricardo pushed a little bit on the changing character, most notably of X. But also, you talked about Han Alcott's study about you become more informed.
Yep.
Do you become more informed by Facebook when Facebook deliberately de-emphasizes political information because it's trying to pull itself out of politics? So I guess I have two questions about that. First, how do we think about regulation when these big companies are responding to political pressure in a diversity of ways? X is lining up behind a potential winner, and Facebook is saying, we don't want to be involved with this. And second, how do we think about cumulative social science for social media when what may have been studied in 2018 may be very different from what we're looking at in 2024?
Thank you. We'll just take a few questions, and then this gentleman over here.
Thanks. Very interesting talk.
Can you speak up, please, and tell us your name?
Yes, Neil Koenig, former BBC journalist. Is there any evidence to show that the effect of priming wears off over time? And I don't know whether you can compare that with, say, health warnings on things like cigarettes.
Lady over there. Okay.
Good.
Are there online? Oh, there's also the audience following us online, which is very sizable. There are questions coming up? No, not yet.
I think these are excellent questions. Let me take the question on priming first. So there is now a lot more work on priming than I mentioned, done by social psychologists. There was a link, there was a reference on the slide, Pennycook and Rand, Gordon Pennycook and David Rand, and a few co-authors have done many studies on priming. Some of those actually look at persistence, and it seems to work, but this is all very recent, right? So we don't really know. That said, I should say we still print health warnings on cigarettes. We still require health warnings on cigarettes, probably for first-time users, and on cigarettes, on alcohol bottles. And so it may wear off, we don't know, but we still don't know. We still don't know. But overall, I would say that since we keep printing health warning on cigarettes, it costs us nothing to do the same thing. So overall, it seems to be a very, very useful intervention. On the regulation of Facebook and X, so indeed, Facebook, mostly for political reputational reasons, started to become less political. The studies that I mentioned, Hunt Alcott and Matt Gensko's paper, was the study I think was done in 2017 or 18, I think, 18. Indeed, the difficulty of studying those things is that the companies change all the time. The algorithms change over time, all the time. It's very hard to catch up with the change. What we study today is different from what we would have studied 2 years ago. Actually, that last paper I was talking about, experiment, was 2022. In 2024, things seem to be different because the nature of misinformation has changed. People are have much harder time to figure out whether it's false or true and whether it's Republican or Democrat. So the messages are so confusing now that people who used to be very good in distinguishing false versus true now have harder time to figure out what's going on. So it's actually a very dynamic environment, and as you rightly said, that adds difficulty of regulating those companies. And that's why Digital Service Act is in general so good, because basically it requires transparency. So it says you must be able to show your algorithm to external scrutiny, right? Remember, we have auditors in corporate world. Corporations are not required to show everything they do to the public, but auditors can see much more than general public, and it's okay, and we survive that, right? So we can imagine audit of algorithms in the same way that Deloitte or KPMG look at corporate accounts and internal corporate procedures, right? So in that sense, I think it's a good idea. But colleagues in AI world tell me that AI Act goes too far. But one of the things I can tell you, I don't do research on AI exactly for the reasons that it makes no sense. It changes much faster than you can do any research. And some people do that, and then they publish papers and they say, effect of AI is such and such and such, but this study was done a year ago, so absolutely it's completely out of date. But overall, I think we see that self-regulation is not sufficient. I would say that one of the things I didn't talk about, I mentioned mental health, I mentioned addiction. So somebody like Matt Gensko, co-author of Hunt Alcott, would say that this is the main reason to regulate, because this stuff is actually addictive, and it's made addictive. You can try that by switching this for you and following on Twitter. You can see how boring it is to do just non-algorithmic stuff, which is what I do. I'm reasonably happy about that. I do get informed because I follow BBC, so I get news from BBC. But I don't get addicted because I don't get exciting stuff promoted by X. Yeah.
Rana Mitter.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. When trying to think about liberal democratic polities that, at least at first glance, don't seem to have had the same sort of problems with insurgent populist parties while having very high levels of high quality mobile internet provision, Japan came to mind. And that makes me wonder, is it the lack of the right kind of social issues that cause populist responses, e.g. very low immigration, or the structural nature of parties in Japan tend to be very solid, although it's a democratic society, it's very rare, even in the current circumstance where the ruling LDP has lost power, lost seats, it doesn't lose power? Or are there factors that, I mean, clearly there are, but what are the factors beyond the availability of 5G that would change that equation if you change the liberal polity that you're dealing with?
I think it's a great question, and I don't know enough about Japan. You're right, immigration is very low. And you're right, party system is very different. And party systems matter there, right? So being able to enter with a new party in France makes it a very different system from, say, US, where you cannot create a third party, right? So these things actually matter, but I just don't know, and I won't speculate because I think I'm not an expert.
Thank you.
On this.
That was our former esteemed colleague, Rana Mitter, who's now at Harvard. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Anna.
Rana actually introduced himself.
Oh, he did.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Anna. I'm a DPhil student here in biochemistry. I was wondering about the subscription-based model that you mentioned. I'm wondering if that could create an even higher division in the society, because the people who could afford to pay for the subscription would get a very different view of the world than the people who cannot afford to do that. So wouldn't that create an even higher division, an even higher kind of problems?
Thanks. I don't think subscription would be very expensive, and we see that Twitter, I think, charges also like $8 or $10, which I prefer not to pay. I did try to use Facebook on a subscription basis. literally changes nothing for me. But overall, it's an interesting experiment because everybody's criticized advertising-based model. Everybody said you need to introduce subscription-based model. Elon Musk did introduce subscription-based model. It didn't change anything, right? So it's an interesting question whether we can actually walk away from advertising-based model. There are proposals to tax social media advertising revenues, but unless you offer a convincing alternative, I don't know where it would lead. But one of the stories I can tell you for the paper on 3G and 4G internet, we were asked to do case studies. And one of the case studies we did was Brazilian election 2018, which was won by Jair Bolsonaro. And the victory of Bolsonaro was in places covered by 3G and 4G internet. So we actually showed that he got more votes. You would think he would get more votes in rural areas. No, he got more votes in places connected to mobile broadband internet. Interestingly, it was not subscription-based. It was called zero rating plans. What are the zero rating plans? So that goes to your question. In many middle-income and low-income countries, social media offered limited access to internet, where you get access only to Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. No websites, no fact-checking websites, and Bolsonaro campaign was actually run on WhatsApp. WhatsApp was the tool of choice. It's very hard to fact-check the misinformation which is disseminated on WhatsApp. And some people would go as far as to call Bolsonaro a WhatsApp president.
Next question.
And of course, zero rating plans are exactly free because people cannot afford to pay mobile broadband tariffs. Yeah.
Thank you for the amazing talk. My name is Mirakbar. I'm a sixth form student. So I once did research, a research paper on how social media affects the ideology and culture of humans. And my question was to you that how far do you believe that social media, fake news, how far can it change the ideology and how can it form a human thought?
Right, it's a big question, and as I said, the gold standard is this set of what's called meta studies. Meta, not like a scientific philosophical approach, but meta like Facebook. So Facebook gave access to data. They ran experiments together with top political scientists, psychologists, media scholars, and one economist, Matt Gensko. And that shows that in 2020, it didn't really change much. But as I said, Ekaterina Zhuravsky and co-authors have just done this experiment on Twitter, which shows you switch from reverse chronological order to algorithm, and your ideology changes. And the effect is substantial. I don't remember the number, but the effect is not trivial at all in quantitative terms. So that matters. Those algorithms actually matter.
Charles? Gentleman over there. Or, oh, sorry, Charles.
Yeah.
A question online from Uera Gloria. Thank you for a very insightful talk. Can you explain a bit more what is meant by clean countries, where you saw an increase in trust in government? Were there any Africa-specific trends?
Right. So I don't remember anything on Africa. All the clean countries were the usual suspects, as I mentioned. New Zealand, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, and the borderline country was US. So how did we rank the countries? So IMF has done a very interesting data collection exercise. So they subscribe to Economist Intelligence Unit subscription reports for investors, which are quarterly. And then they ran a text analysis machine on those texts. And then they identify a number of corruption incidents in this quarter, in this country. So we treat this measure as a measure of actual corruption. This is valuable information for investors. Investors pay money to get this information. So it's probably not cheap talk. And basically, IMF has produced what's called GC, Global Index of Corruption Indices, something like this. And we use this index, and we rank countries by the number of corruption incidents in this country in this year. And basically, when I said cleanest countries, these are countries which in that period of time had fewer corruption incidents in this particular data set. And as I said, when we use this measure as a measure of actual corruption, we can also see the gap between actual corruption and perceived corruption. In our data set, people are asked, do you think government is corrupt or not? So if you have mobile broadband internet, there is a correlation between actual corruption and perceived corruption. If you don't, you don't. Mobile broadband internet is still an accountability technology. So if you're a corrupt country, social media will disseminate the news about your corruption. As I said, social media are very good in disseminating critical news.
Gerald Dorey, you talked about salience as being one of the most important determinants. Isn't that a rather slippery concept, though? Isn't salience itself easily manipulable by platforms?
Say it again, I didn't hear.
Isn't the salience itself a concept which is susceptible to change and manipulation?
Yeah, so salience indeed is a difficult concept to formalize. Actually, economists and finance scholars working on financial markets now talk a lot about salience right now, measuring and defining it in a different way. Of course, it's not a thing that economists know how to use very well. It's what's coming from psychology. But basically, the way we use it here is just the fact that when you are reminded that there is there are false news on social media, that triggers some reflection. And there are different ways to trigger it. In some of the studies, I mentioned Penny, Cook, and Rand, they just tell you, before sharing, just wait 30 seconds, right? We give this health warning. There are other ways, but basically social media is hitting your emotions. And the idea of salience is before you have a knee-jerk reaction of sharing exciting stuff, we want to trigger the fact that reputational concerns should not be forgotten. And in public opinion studies, of course, it's always very important. In voting studies, it's always very important. You need to trigger some reflection. You need to mention that some issues are salient. Sometimes it's bad. I mentioned immigration. If immigration is a salient issue, you vote for anti-immigration politicians. In some cases, it's good because we try to trigger salience of reputational concerns. Don't forget that your reputation as a credible source may suffer. So I agree with you. We are not very good in actually pinning down what we are talking about.
Sergei, we've come almost to the end of the event. I have just one final question I wanted to ask you, which has to do with those who produce the disinformation. A lot of the attention a few years ago was on state actors. I'm thinking in the case of Russia, for instance, even 2 days ago, Le Monde, as you will have seen, published a very long expose of the use of disinformation in the Central African Republic, in the Sahel, a very sustained effort over years through social media platforms to advance the interests of the private company Wagner. So state actors are important. But what people, I'm thinking, for instance, of the work of Ronald Diebert at the University of Toronto have shown is that there is a very large marketplace for intelligence, for misinformation, private sector providers of such services. It's a fairly international, it's American providers, Israelis, Italians, there's a bit of everything out there. I wonder if you could tell us about that a bit, about that private sector that produces disinformation. And this is not just the sort of the black PR that we've known for many decades, but specifically cutting edge technology companies that are producing the stuff you're writing about.
Right. So let me actually tell you some good news. So if you go back 1 year, everybody says year 2024 is a year of elections. AI is producing deepfakes. There are companies which can produce deepfake of any quality and any direction that you want, that you are ready to pay for. So we'll have a catastrophic year 2024. And interestingly, we had some deepfakes, but not many. And overall, I wouldn't say that these fears were actually confirmed, right? So this year, we still didn't see those private actors producing deepfake videos. Now, how much they produced in terms of texts, tweets, and so on, I don't know. In politics, I would say that indeed the content is now sometimes it's very misleading, but not clear-cut misinformation. And this is what private players are very good at. They want to avoid being caught, and at the same time, they want to stoke doubt, undermine confidence, including confidence in institutions. And so this is what they're very good at. But in the terms of good news, let me leave you with that. Yeah. We've not seen deepfakes being too convincing so far. That said, I have a friend who thought he's talking to a president of a different country on Zoom, and it was a deepfake. Okay. And he was convinced. Yeah. And so, piece of advice on private sector providers of Zoom deepfakes at this stage in 2024, maybe not next year, but 2024, the algorithms are not very good in showing how you drink water on Zoom. So the models actually don't work because they are not trained for this. Maybe next year they will be, but if you ask your counterpart on Zoom to drink a glass of water, if it's a deep fake, it will go crazy. So you will see how the glass is actually entering the face. And so this is a piece of advice, valuable piece of advice for you.
I'm sure both myself and our distinguished audience will keep that advice in mind in our next tryst with a deep fake head of state. And on that note, please join me in thanking Sergei for a wonderful talk.